A warm welcome from all of us here at the library. I'm Francesco Pisano, the director. Today we're going to video this session actually, and I tell you why in a second. And we're going to post it on YouTube. It will be ready in a few working days. So welcome again. We're going to have a discussion today. I hope it will be interesting for you. It will be about the evolution of multilateralism seen from the perspective of the Global South. Now, this is part of our Centenary celebrations. We've been going on since last year, since 19. We wanted to put emphasis on 100 years of multilateralism in Geneva. So this is part of the series of events that we have dedicated to this topic. Why it's happening now? It's because I'm going to introduce them in a second. Two of our panelists, Professor Sluga and Professor Kott, are here for a working meeting we have tomorrow, a working workshop we have tomorrow in the Library and Archives of Geneva. And so we wanted to seize this opportunity to have this talk. And that's why we're having it today. And that's why we're having it with two professors who are not from the Global South. I'll pass you that. But they are experts in international relations, and they're here. So we're getting, two for the price of one. I'm talking about the days, not the professors, because they're here tomorrow. So let me introduce very briefly who we have selected for this panel. I'm very proud that my team was able to assemble this panel. So Professor Sluga here on my left, she's professor of international history at the University of Sydney, and you're in Europe for you haven't flown here for this, but you're stationed here in Europe for a few years, and so thank you for joining us. You're not in Geneva, so you traveled for this in any case. Ambassador Youssef, who's sitting next to Professor Sluga, is the permanent representative of Egypt to the UN. He's been doing that since November 17. Before that, he was the spokesperson of the Egyptian presidency. And before that, he was working in Barcelona, where he was the political advisor of the Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean. He was also posted in Beirut, in Paris, among other places. Thank you, Ambassador. It's an honor to have you here in the library. Then next to the ambassador is Professor Sandrine Kott, from University of Geneva, where she's professor of European contemporary history. Professor Kott is also a researcher active in the areas of social welfare, labor law, and she's actually a client of ours, if I may so, of the International Archives of International Organizations. She's currently working on primary sources at the ILO and UNCTAD, and so she's a regular of our knowledge system. Thank you, Professor, for taking the time being on the panel. And then Ueli Steiger is a PhD candidate at the Graduate Institute here next door, and he's writing or researching on financing and reforming of the African Union. So we called on him, and he's the first of, I hope, a long series. That seat there will be from now on in our library talks reserved to the youth, to a young researcher, a young practitioner, but someone who's definitely younger than our normal panelists. And from now on, we're going to do that. And so you're the first, and feel welcome. It's a pleasure to have you. So let's perhaps get started. This is a classical library talk, so we'll have a time for the audience to ask you questions, take advantage that you're all here. But I would like to start by putting the things in context, and maybe Professor Sluga, you can help me with the definition of at least two key terms. So how do we define Global South, first of all? I know there are several ways to define that, but at least that we have an operational definition so we can be on the same page as we discuss this topic. And perhaps about also internationalism and the relationship to multilateralism. What is the definition of these terms, and how do they relate to one another?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's so great to be here in this hall, which really resonates the history of an international multilateralism. And so let me start with those terms, because they're so important. As you'll see, if you walk across the foyer there, you'll find the exhibition on the Centenary of multilateralism that associates multilateralism with the origins of the institution that led to the creation of this building, of course, the League of Nations. Now, if you asked an historian, maybe even 20 years ago, what multilateralism was, they might straight away say, well, you have to go back to the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, and the multilateralism is just about countries getting together and making treaties amongst more than two people. That's a technical definition. But the centenary of the League really celebrates, I think, a particular phase in the history of multilateralism where we might think that the word internationalism is really significant. And it's that juxtaposition of internationalism and multilateralism that is celebrated in the centenary. So the League as a turning point moment in a longer history of international thinking and the creation of international institutions as a form of multilateral organisation, if you like. And with that came a whole group of larger questions about what countries could agree on and how they might agree, how they might use arbitration. And I think it's important to think about the significance of the era of international multilateralism preceding the League, but the League as a kind of symbol of it, by looking at how it's in debate now. So I think it was last year the American Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, said, multilateralism was a bad thing, and he pointed to the Universal Postal Union. So that is an organisation created in Bern in 1874, and if you think of, you walk the streets of Geneva, big post office you'll see, and it has all the different countries sort of named around the side of it. And so that was a multilateral institution that was created, of course, to establish the kind of international system of stamps and taxation that would allow the smooth communication of mail and money in the latter part of the 19th century, in which we still have. And it also introduced the idea that the participating member states had to arbitrate their differences, not go to war or walk away from each other, but actually arbitrate their differences around these issues. So those are the kind of principles that fed the international multilateralism that was at the forefront of thinking when the League of Nations was created. Now, the Global South is a much more recent term. We can relate it to the rise in popularity of global as an idea in the 1980s, 90s, and there are people in the room that have written about this. But the idea behind it, that it represents a particular part of the world that is treated unequally, is embedded in this notion of the Global South. And I would say that that is actually a dimension or a characteristic of the international multilateralism that goes further back into the beginnings of the 20th century and the origins of the League of Nations as well. These were contested issues about economic inequality, about political inequality that were embedded in the creation of the international multilateral institution that the League was. So we have a term that, in the 70s you might have used third world, and before then post-colonial or colonial societies, but the issues that are part of this idea of the Global South, and it doesn't have to be in the South. I come from the Southern Hemisphere, and within my country, Australia, you could argue that the Global South is within the South because we have a discriminated and disadvantaged Indigenous population. So the Global South is not a specific place in the world, really, but it is a concept that comes out of questions of fundamental inequality that have been part of the building of these international multilateral institutions and attempts to tackle those problems.
Professor Cott, I see you nodding, and in fact, this is the definition. If this is the definition of Global South, then it goes without a doubt that what we call the UN system, the structures that came into being after the Second World War, were designed, created, voted upon in the relative absence of the Global South. Now, I would like to ask you, in your studies, your research, and your practice, how would you sort of size the impact that that fact has had on what is known today as the international order, the system, or even the international UN system as we know it?
Thank you for this very interesting question, and thank you to give this kind of order, because what I want to say fits very nicely with what Glenda was saying. So, in fact, we have to know that, and she was referring to that, Glenda, in a certain way, that in the way historians have worked on international organization, on the League of Nations, and also on the UN. Some have argued that, in fact, international organizations have been founded to consolidate and to protect, in a certain way, colonial empires. It was the way some historians, I think of Mark Mazur and others. So do we have to believe them? That's the point. And in fact, when we look at the history of the UN, we have to go to a kind of opposite conclusion, at least for the time between the 50s and the 70s. What happens during this time is that with the entry of the newly decolonized countries, we have a new UN in a certain way. I mean, we have to know that in 1955, there were 76 countries in the UN. In 1975, there were 144 countries. Most of the new countries were newly decolonized countries. What do these countries do with the UN, for the UN, and how do they change the UN? That's very important. That's what happens. First of all, interestingly, these newly decolonized countries use the UN Charter. They use it for their own purposes. And for example, it is in the UN with the declaration it's a declaration on it's a resolution, excuse me, we have to be precise. It's a resolution 514 on the granting of independence to colonial countries and people, that in fact the right to decolonization in the UN was in a certain way asserted. So that's very important because it was in the UN that this thing happened, and it was not declared by the big powers. It was really declared within the UN. It's very important. So, and secondly, which is also very important, what we could call a kind of third internationalism, the third worldism, as it was called at that time, got organized within the UN, within the United Nations. It is in the United Nations that these countries came together and formed and built what was called the G77, and it was within the UN that this country also founded the United Nations Trade and Development Organization, the UNCTAD organization. I always forget, how to develop the acronyms, because it's not the same in French and in English and of course in German. So I always get confused. So anyway, it's very important to know that the UN was in a certain way used by this global South country in order to make themselves known and heard, but that also the UN was revived in a certain way by these countries themselves. But of course, they had several claims to express, and they used the UN to express this claim. And then I'm completely in tune with what Glenda was already saying. Their main claim was equality, more equality. So, and for that, they used the UN, but the UN also used them in a certain way in order to make these claims heard. And in particular, there are several steps, and it goes until this last step, which is very important and which has been really commented by historians recently, the new international economic order in 1974. Everybody has forgotten about it because it was not realized, as we know, but it was very important at that time, and it was really a period during which, in fact, the global South was really proposing things, new things, through the UN for the entire world. So it was a different era. It was an era during which the global South, and thanks to the UN in a certain way, was able to promote a new international economic order. So as we know, it didn't. There was no reality. In fact, there was a very big backlash. And my opinion is that, in fact, the neoliberal moment in which we are still now is not a reaction to the oil prices and so on, but it's a reaction. It's a reaction against, in fact, this declaration at the new UN General Assembly for a new international economic order. Because when you look at the way, the International Chamber of Commerce, for example, or several countries organized against and assembled and mobilized against this declaration, then you see that there was really a threat. They thought it was a threat, and this threat came from the global south through the UN.
Thank you. So basically the image we have is that the global south did not build the house, but they benefited from being inside the house, because once inside the house that we call the UN, that they could express themselves differently as a group, and actually in the end they even revived the house.
You might say, that, and we can come back to this, but actually I don't know you would so quickly say that they didn't build the house.
That's very interesting then.
But I think, but they did use it. But I think there are other parts to that story, depending on when.
And we'll get to that. Well, exactly, because actually this is what I heard as well. It's not so black and white in terms of they were there, they weren't there, and so let's go back to that. But before, I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Youssef. So you're the permanent representative of Egypt. Your job is to represent your country at the UN. Your job is to be in the UN, and so. You've been in the UN also before, because maybe you were in New York, right? In Geneva as a deputy. Okay, but you were before in Geneva.
I started my career in Geneva, 94.
There you go.
I was a young attaché at that time.
Exactly. And so I wanted to ask you, North and South at the UN today.
Well, let me start first by thanking you for inviting me to take part in this, in the library talks organized on the occasion of celebrating the centenary of the multilateral system. And to answer your question, I just want to agree on a term. Professor was just talking about the Southern Hemisphere. So when your question is focusing on North and South, we talk about developed and developing countries, of course. So let me tell you that the current relationship between North and South had been very much developed with the multilateral system represented by the United Nations. When I look at the period of the 50s and 60s, and I look back on this difficult moment of the history of the United Nations, and then today, when I look at the relations between North and South, definitely it's much more developed. Many documents had been trying to get both sides together and to bridge the gap, but the gap still exists. We have many documents adopted by the United Nations, like the Agenda 2030, like the Sustainable Development Goals, and recently the Global Compact on Migration and Global Compact on Refugees. This reflects that the strong will of the international community to move ahead and to get both sides together in order to achieve many objectives for the humanity. But the most important point here, the lack of implementation. Are we really ready to implement fully these documents that were adopted or not? This is the first point I want to raise. The geopolitical challenges facing the world right now, and many conflicts, especially in my part of the world, in the Middle East, the tension which arising in many parts as well, the digital divide, the economic inequalities, terrorism, these are important challenges that require strong and true commitment from both sides, from the North and the South, to be able to find solutions and to move ahead. What we need right now is a collective action and approach in dealing with these challenges. I think it was very clear when the United Nations was founded that we have an objective, an important objective to reach, and we have to work both sides, North and South, to implement it.
Thank you so much. I think this introduces an interesting, and I want to go back to that. Perhaps global problem solving, getting to work all together on the Agenda 2030, perhaps that is beyond the old concept, geopolitical concept of North and South. Perhaps this is an angle that we would want to go back to. But let me now invite Ueli here, whoever is Steiger, our young participant, to perhaps you can give us an insight, because you're researching the African Union. So you just heard 3 experts give their opinion. Maybe you can link it to your study. Maybe yes, maybe no, I don't know. It's an open question to you. If you see in your studies any evidence of this conversation going on in the African Union, if you can tell us, I'm not asking you to give us the position of the African Union, of course, but as a researcher in international relations, what is that you see?
Thank you very much, and let me start by commending you and your team for this youth seat that I feel is very big for one person to fill, so I look forward to future participants as well. But being the young researcher is a label that I'm more comfortable with than being from the global south, so that's great. But I'm very glad to be part of this conversation. So the organization that I've spent a number of years studying, looking at, visiting now, the African Union, is a young organization compared to the UN, compared to other international organizations. But it's, I would say, the fruit of labor of a long historical process, deeply interlinked with decolonization, deeply interlinked with gaining political power, making decisions, producing building the buildings. I like this phrase that was put out already. So the predecessor of this organization came out of the time of decolonization in the 60s. It was called the Organization of African Unity. That was less powerful, shall we say, than today's African Union, that really delivers on all sorts of levels. And I think one of the important phrases in creating this African agency that is driving the African Union is this very famous phrase of African solutions for African problems. And here's the problems that you mentioned, ambassadors. I personally don't like this phrase very much, and let me tell you why. It is because it pretends that the problems faced on the African continent are African only. But the African continent, 60% of the UN Security Council agenda is on the African continent, by the way. So it's very much a global issue. And so I prefer the phrase African-led solutions for problems in Africa. Slight nuance, but I think these are the problems that the African Union now has started to attack. And they're understanding how to get the power of 55 countries to vote, be it here in Geneva. I'm sure Ambassador has been in a few coordination meetings with his African colleagues, be it in New York, and they manage to coordinate votes, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but we shouldn't forget that even the EU member states do not manage to reach consensus on many, many things. So there are certain limits here at the UN to how far you can integrate. But it could be Security Council votes, it could be General Assembly votes, where really African countries are successfully getting together. And the other aspect where the African Union has helped is speaking with one voice towards partners, such as the European Union, that has, shall we say, an agenda that is explicit and ambitious with and for Africa's countries and populations, but also China, India, Turkey, and so on. So it's, perhaps we can say like this, it's added a level between states and the UN. The African Union has added an interior, shall we say, floor in the building of global governance that is very interesting, and I would say is only going to gain in relevance in the decades to come.
Well, thank you. I know, Professor Slugada, you wanted to say something about, were they really absent when we built the thing? But, and of course, feel free to do that. But at this point, I thought I would rather ask you, in terms of international relations studies, this body of knowledge, of this theorizing, is rather Western in the end. I was reading a paper, a 2017 paper by, I noted it down, Van Abdallah and others, 3 experts, were actually arguing quite fiercely that the whole mainstream international relation theory being written by Westerners is faulty because it doesn't take account of all the, Global South scholars themselves. So I'm talking about really academic research. And so in the end, they would say that this constitutes a faulty base for the theorizing of international relations. Would you agree with that statement?
I'm really not an international relations scholar, but I guess that's a kind of judgment that gets really charged at historians as well sometimes about who's writing this history and that it's not scholars from the Global South. Can I just say that, one of the issues, I think that's obviously that is an issue, that, knowledge production is still in the hands of Western institutions. And within that idea, of course, there are all sorts of hierarchies. So, often people from European institutions complain about the dominance of the United States or, Anglophone institutions. And so everybody has a kind of notion of where they sit in a hierarchy. So that is a kind of a problem that Russian dolls almost, right? So, and then some institutions are the least powerful. But I think actually what's interesting is that, I've had a lot to do with UNESCO, and what I've found interesting about that international multilateral institution is the role it's played in trying to tackle that for a long time, actually, and not always from a perspective that we would agree with now necessarily, but noticing the, inequities in knowledge production. And I think, so the concomitant of the NIEO, of the new International Economic Order, was the new International Information Order, wasn't it, in the 70s? And they came together because people understood that, how knowledge was produced and disseminated, like who dominated the news production, was then both reflective of and reflecting these other kinds of economic hierarchies, who has power. So I'm sure that also happens. And in fact, there are really interesting new studies of international law that also show that actually, is it international or, is it reflecting the legal institutions and peoples of certain countries, right? It's not really international. So I think that's true. And I think one of the things that historians can do in this context, so if I can go back to this, is both to think about, and feminist historians do this too with women, is both to point out the exclusion of those voices. So, a feminist historian or feminist IR person will say, actually, nobody listens to women writing either, right? And an historian would say, actually, what I can do is to notice when they did. And so that comes back. That is a way back, a segue back to that issue about who do international institutions represent? Do they represent the dominant institutions in terms of Anglophone or Western who have more economic power and more military power and control knowledge production? Or have they been able to, in fact, be more inclusive? And I think, obviously, the answer is both, right? So this is what Sandrine was pointing to, that these institutions, international multilateralism, grows out of this tension of both being institutions that are shaped by dominant imperial powers and institutions that are exploited, manipulated, negotiated by the colonial subjects, by women who don't have a voice in other contexts. In the 1930s, Ralph Bunche became a really important figure in the United Nations in the early administration. He actually was a political scientist, the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard. And his thesis was he went to Africa and he compared the different colonies, those that were directly under France or Britain or what was left of the Portuguese colonies then probably, and those colonies that had been taken from the defeated German power and placed in trustee as mandates at that time, right? And he said, what's the difference? So he looked at them, and in particularly two French colonies. He said the only difference he could find, it was small, it was very small, because a lot of the African populations of the mandates didn't even know they were in mandates, right? But those that knew used that power to both tell the imperial power, we know we can go to the League of Nations, or to petition. He said, as far as he was concerned, that was enough to justify the existence of this idea of some kind of international oversight, and he built on that. He became the director of trusteeship, ironically, which was the UN version of mandates afterwards. And I think if you look closely, you see him using his authority and power to bring African NGOs in, or people trying to kind of question the ways in which the imperial powers had ordered Africa and what they were doing with it. And I wanted to I think there's a really interesting, you could track Egyptian stories and all this. So we know that Egypt was among the first of the League member states as not a state, right? So really interesting. And I found that in the early days of UNESCO, one of the first directors of the Social Sciences Division was an Egyptian geographer called Muhammad Awad. He wasn't there very long. And I'm doing a project on this with a friend of mine who's a scholar of Egyptian history. And what he did in that very short time was to try and make UNESCO use its power to tackle questions of economic and labour inequality in the colonial, post-colonial territories. It didn't last very long, so I don't know why they got rid of him. But anyway, but he's there, So finding those voices, I think, shifts our understanding of, both. So if you say, yes, both those things were happening at the same time, exclusion and inclusion, and that's really important to have both there.
But this is a perfect point to bring you back in the discussion, Ambassador. Egypt is an extraordinary player at global level. You have at least two enormous powers that everyone knows about. It's your history, heritage, and this incredible geographical, co-location on our planet. And so with that comes responsibility, it comes genius among the founders of the non-alignment movement. It comes also a special role. So tell us a little bit about that as the role of your country in all of this.
Sure. As you know, and you rightly said, Egypt is a founding member of the United Nations. And throughout the years, the Egyptian diplomacy had contributed enormously in shaping the treaties and the conventions in all fields. Let me just recall that the first Secretary General of UNCTAD was an Egyptian. We have another Egyptian who was Secretary General of the United Nations, Boutros Ghali, the late, and he was my professor at the university, and he's someone that we have a great esteem and great appreciation for him in Egypt. We're coming from different circles, starting, of course, with the Arab circle. And by the way, we had also contributed to the establishment of the Arab League, which was established before the United Nations, by the way. And we also had founded and contributed to the founding of the African, actually at that time it was the Organization of African Unity. And I have a lot of things, by the way, to comment on issues raised by our panelist on the African Union. He raised a very important point that I would like to comment. And at the same time, we are the founding member of the non-aligned movement, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and as well the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, which was later on developed to the Union for the Mediterranean and the neighborhood policy. So as you see, we are coming from different circles that we could capitalize on all these circles to be able to contribute to finding solutions and try to finding common grounds and to find solutions for many problems that arise. If I may, just to comment on the African Union, first of all, the African Union is not a new organization. It goes back to 1963, when it was established under the Organization of African Unity. What happened in 2000 that the Africans decided to give a new boost to their relations, especially on economic and social levels. When they decided to launch the slogan of African solutions for African problems, this was not because they want to have exclusive rights to dealing with international topics. Not, of course not. But just to let the whole international community know that they know their priorities and they cannot accept someone to impose solutions on them. And coming from this continent and also being part in different meetings and different summits in Africa, there is a very strong will for African countries to find solutions for their problems. With all due respect, the international community has been witnessing for many, many problems in Africa for years without providing any solution. But in the African Union, we were able to find solutions for many conflicts in Africa. And still, we are developing new tools for economic and social integration, besides, of course, of trying to find solutions for the conflicts in the continent. So there's much progress that had been done throughout the last few years. The latest initiative, which was raised last year, is silencing the guns. This is another major initiative by the African countries at the time that the field of disarmament is totally blocked for years. And there are treaties which exist for more than 50 years, and unfortunately, obligations and commitments are not being implemented. So the African Union is doing a lot and is contributing to international efforts in finding solutions to many problems.
Thank you. And again, this point of agreeing on principles and writing and voting resolutions is one thing. The will to implement them and change things is another. Thank you for reminding us. Perhaps we'll go back to this point. But I wanted to go back to you, Professor Cott. You have this research going on social welfare, labor law. There is an expectation, at least I read in various articles and journals, that there is this expectation by aggregating the global South academically, diplomatically, in terms of theorizing to, let's say, international relations globally conceived of. There is an expectation that these areas of application will improve. Why? Well, because there is more tendency to look at things in a holistic way, the less the global South would be, I'm saying would be, it is what I read, less prisoner of dichotomies that are typical of Western power projection, like the Cold War. If you look at the Cold War from the angle of a bipolar world, then it was a peace time. If you look at it from the global South point of view, it was ridden with conflict, for example. So how do you have evidence of this expectation that it would be better because there is more global South involvement in your research?
Thank you for your question. And again, it's like Glenda said. I mean, it's a very it's very paradoxical situation, because of course on one side you're right, I mean the expectation is here, but on the other side, if you look precisely on the ILO, on the International Labour Organization, I mean the integration of the newly decolonized country, I prefer that at Global South, has always been very complicated. Why? Because most of the labor standards were standards which have been invented or found out or in the Western Hemisphere, in developed countries. And then, you know, what most of the international civil servants, at the beginning at least, what they wanted to do is just, you know, to generalize what they've done for the West to the Global South. And it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. It's not possible. So there were a lot of tensions. And from the beginning, in fact, you had Asian countries, less developed like China, like Japan, for example. These people were saying, no, it's not for us, because it's not what we want. What we want is development, is economic development first. And then maybe we can have social development. So they were putting the emphasis on development. And in fact, it's also what the ILO has done, after all, you know, in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and most of what the ILO has done was development project. So, but what do you have with this development project? It means that, in fact, economic is primordial and social is the second thing. Of course, you can see the word completely differently. You can think of the world like, if you don't develop the people, if you don't develop the social, then the economic, you cannot develop the economic. But it's not what the ILO was doing, and not because of the ILO. The ILO is just part of a kind of general trend. It's not that the people were bad in this organization. I mean, so you have that. And in fact, the newly decolonized country and the global south country are trapped in a contradiction right now. That's the reason why, for example, like in 1995, when the ILO was, l'OMC, the WHO was founded, you know, there was this idea that in the WHO you should have a social clause in each contract, and the people who voted, I mean the groups who voted against that were in particular the Indian trade unionists, because they were saying, if we do that, then, you know, we have a kind of advantage which is built on our cheap labor market. And if we vote for this kind of social clause within trade agreements, then we will be at disadvantage. So it's using in a certain way, but it's a contradiction because in fact, on their view, they're right. But on a view from the people from the north, the trade unionists from the north, for example, of course, you know, it's a way of using cheap labor in order to have this kind of economic advantage. So that's a real problem. And lastly, you know, it has been also it's very interesting how the global south interest can go hand in hand with the international organization interest and can be defended by international organization. Look at one thing which is so important right now, the global value chains. The global value chains, which in a certain way lead to big catastrophes, like what has been going on in Bangladesh, for example. You know, I mean, the crash of big buildings and so on. It's just not the Rana Plaza, but there were a lot of others. So the way to regulate that is really to try to regulate multinational corporation. It has been a big discussion in the 70s, then it has been shut off and so on in the 90s and so on. So, but it's again a big discussion. And then for this discussion, the global south countries should in fact work together with the UN, because you cannot fight as an individual country against multinational corporations, which are huge right now. So, you know, if you really want to regulate this kind of global value chain in global south and the way that in fact it exploits the global south laborers, then, I mean, working together with international organizations from the part of global south countries is absolutely crucial.
Welly, do you have any reactions to what you heard?
Sure, I think I can take Professor Kotz and link this to the point that you made quite nicely. This working with countries from around the globe, be it the Southern Hemisphere or the global South, let's say the non-founding members of the UN. I think it's important to see that as you rightly say, Ambassador, the African Union, for example, institutionally has achieved quite a lot. To the point that we could say that there are some institutional innovations that would be interesting to consider at the level of the UN, be it, shall we say, the crisis of assessed contributions that has been ongoing at the UN level, where the African Union has come up with innovative funding schemes where a 0.2% levy is put on eligible imports into the African continent, which has helped Egypt and many other big countries had no problems paying the contribution, but middle-tier countries suffered to come up with the contributions. And now this is being taken automatically off of imports, and they manage to pay their assessed contributions. So this is an innovation that comes from the global south, and I think it would be potentially interesting for the global level as well. And the other level, the other point where the AU and potentially other regional organizations such as OSCE have made progress as well is peacekeeping, where in the case of the AU, the rules of engagement are more advanced in the way that peace enforcement is possible, anti-terror operations are more easily conductible. The AU missions are less expensive as well than the UN missions that cost quite a lot. So there's great interest in looking at other organizations for the UN as well. And this way, the universality of the UN is its big selling point. But beyond that universality, how do you keep it alive? How do you make it a 21st century organization? And I think here we need to not only consider Western thinking, but indeed not just thinking, but practices from Global South organizations such as the African Union. And that's gonna help fix things in the long run.
As a young researcher, would you agree then that this new type of global problems are less solvable with logics that are north, south, or west and east? Do you see this as going forward, for example, this new way of conceiving of global strategies like Agenda 2030 is what the ambassador was saying, and I'm very sympathetic to that point of view. Problems have changed, and if we do not adapt our strategies, then we will be unable to solve them. What is your point of view?
Yeah, I think we're seeing shifts in this kinds of thinking in all sorts of ways, and that aid in and of itself is not a model that is working that much anymore, that we need to take countries that are affected by crisis seriously, that this thinking has been around for a while in academia. I think, that maybe we should think about how country systems are affected by crises, by insecurity, by development aid, and work with the systems in order to build up the good governance, build up the good systems. So I think this is something that's happening, and we can certainly do more to sustain it still. Yeah.
Well, I think we just set the scene for a good session with the question and answer from the audience. We're going to take questions in batches so that it doesn't become a discussion, a bilateral discussion. So I would like to take 3 or 4 at this stage. If there are questions from the audience, could you please raise your hand so a microphone can get to you, and just say who you are, your affiliation, and then make your question. We prefer questions to statements, please. So I have 2 here in this way. I have the ambassador of Armenia here first, and then the lady, and then one in the front row there. Okay, with these 3 first, and then we'll go. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I hope I will not abuse your patience by making a very short statement. First, thanking, of course, the library for organizing such kind of events, which are very important on very timely and interesting topics, and also to thank the speakers for very enlightening presentations. Indeed, the issue of multilateralism and the role of the states in it is a very interesting topic and something that keeps our minds of politicians and diplomats very busy at many times. So I would like to hear comment also from distinguished ambassador of Egypt on what I'm going to say about the role of multilateralism in terms of being providing a possibility for being heard. Of course, I'm coming from Armenia. I don't know how south is Armenia situated. Usually in our part of the world we are using different terms, it's like east, west, and maybe others. But I think I grasped the concept. I understanding what we are here talking about. But again, as a relatively new country, newcomer to the family of independent states, on different stages of our recent history, independent history, we were looking to the international organizations for their real help. And here where the international organizations are playing an important role for such countries as Armenia, and I guess I am speaking also on behalf of many others, and you mentioned also regional organizations like OSCE, Council of Europe. Indeed, I cannot but agree that in many cases there are lack of implementation. But these organizations are also norm-setting organizations, and organizations which are providing us with norms and principles to which especially the new independent states are looking how to develop their countries, not just in a political terms, but also economically. So I would be very much interested to listen if this is the case also with long established countries with a long uninterrupted independent history as Egypt is. And of course you mentioned about the history of Egypt and their culture, but I would like also here to add also the human capital of Egypt, which you have, Ambassador, very rightly mentioned, Boutros Ghali and many others. Whenever I worked in different international organizations and countries, Egyptian diplomats are really one of the strongest, one of the most intellectual representatives of their countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And the lady?
Thank you very much. My name is Beres Gwynn. I'm a former Australian diplomat. My claim to fame is that I was expelled from my last assignment. I want to suggest that our afternoon might have been more progressively spent if we talked about the need for transformation of the multilateral system, because everything screams at me that we do not have time for an evolutionary process which is actually inhibiting our taking the decisions that are needed on global issues. My question to the members of the panel is whether they would agree or disagree with the notion that the multilateral system that we know has been entirely subverted by power. Powerful countries that should have done more to prevent rising inequality have done less. Poorer countries, in inverted commas, developing countries, often have leadership that has been completely subverted, and so are actually serving the global north rather than defending the interests of the global south. And my last question to the panel is, to what extent do we feel locked into the borders of nation states that colonial powers drew 400 years ago and decided about notions of sovereignty that served European countries well, but are now actually frustrating our ability to deal with global issues? So really, these are three dimensions of what I see as the need for transformation of the multilateral system. And I'm absolutely looking to the regional examples that show us that when people are serious about dealing with these issues, there are much more creative ways than for us to be working in global conferences that say a lot but don't do anything. I'm sorry to be so rude. Thank you.
I thought you were going to get a round of applause on this one, but they surprised me. That's done. Then.
Thank you.
The
Thank
lady
you so
in
much.
first row.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Egyptian diplomat, and it happened to be Ambassador Yusuf, my boss. So I will direct the question to the panel, except my boss. So. Actually, my question is so much related to the previous one, because maybe we've been digging a lot in the role of the Global South and the colonialism and the United Nations and the League of Nations and everything. But we haven't talked about the attack against multilateralism these days and the responsibility of the Global North. Do you think that the Global North is responsible really about this attack? It's not only a financial attack, but maybe it's an attack against the international legal order that has been established for years. We have like Security Council resolutions which are not respected. We have international legal system which is not also respected. So I would like to listen from you more on this regarding the role of the Global North in respecting the multilateralism. And once again, thank you for your informative views. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I see what, maybe we can take 4 and then we go for a second round. I see a hand up there. The gentleman in the white shirt. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Diego Valadares. I work in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights with the Right to Development section. And in the section we work with, we notice that there's a clear cleavage on how the voting procedures go, and we can see the non-aligned movement voting one way, the other country, European Union and other countries voting another way. The G77, especially in New York, we also see these cleavages. So how realistic it is, and going to your last question to our youth panelists, how realistic it is to say that we should be moving beyond North-South cleavages? Wouldn't that be, in a certain way, erased contradictions that do exist, and perhaps by doing so you'll be serving the interests of not solving the issues that these contradictions want to address?
Okay, so why don't we feel free to respond to what you hear the most as a question. So Ambassador, you want to go first?
Thank you very much. Let me start first by thanking Ambassador of Armenia. And I would like to seize the opportunity to commend the very rich role that the Armenian community has played and will continue to play in Egypt and the whole Middle East. And since we're speaking about Egyptian diplomacy, the first Egyptian minister of foreign affairs was Armenian, by the way, in 1923. Just to let you know, the important role that the Armenian community had played in the history of my country. I agree with him that United Nations has been always a forum for dialogue, and that everyone has a possibility to be heard. Throughout the years, and since 1945, we had too many conflicts that were discussed in the United Nations, and all sides had the opportunity to speak up and to present the positions. Many resolutions were adopted, and here I would like to agree with my colleague that unfortunately many of these resolutions were never adopted, were never implemented, and till the day we have many problems in finding a solution because many resolutions were not adopted throughout the years. And I would like as well just to comment on other questions and comments made during the discussion on the transformation of multilateral system. Definitely, I think it's very important that we talk about the transformation. In my introductory remarks, I talked about the gap which still exists and with the need to find bridges. And this is what we are trying to do in any forum of the United Nations, especially on the Human Rights Council. And here I would like to dwell on the last comment made. It's not always between developing countries or non-aligned countries and the others, and Western and European countries. No, you could find, it depends on the topic itself. There are topics which even between the non-aligned countries, there's no agreement. So I would not take it as if it is kind of confrontation between North and South or non-aligned countries and European countries. No, I would not take it that way. But what I always say, and I truly believe, that we are here to find solutions and to bridge gaps and to find a common ground. And this is what I always say to my colleagues from different groups, that we are paid to find solutions and not to complicate the situation, and especially in the Council of Human Rights. We want to have something concrete which the populations and the people who suffer really find tangible change that taking place. Thank
you. So thank you for this very interesting question. I was particularly interested in what you were saying for Armenia, because in fact what you were saying is so, in a way, excuse me to be a little bit too historian for you, but very typical of new countries. You know, new countries look at international organizations not because they know that they will implement their norms, because we know they never do, but because they offer resources to these countries. They offer, in a certain way, for example, like technical assistance, like a place where they can meet other countries and other people, a place where they can be heard in a certain way. So international organization and the UN system has always been a very important resource for new countries. So, and it's not just because you have declaration and so on, which are, we know, never implemented. It's because beyond that, international organizations do things and embody values which are still important. So we shouldn't really look at everything which has not been implemented, because it's not, we know international organizations cannot implement what they promise to do. But these are places in which new countries and small countries and weak countries can say things. And they can also, say things together in a certain way. It was exactly the role of the UN for non-aligned countries. And, what is non-alignment without the UN? It doesn't exist. The UN makes this country in a certain way, and this new non-aligned country exists. So the point is that we have to be very careful with multilateralism and don't, throw the baby with the bath in a certain way. It's not because the water of the bath, I don't know, l'eau du bain. So it's not because the UN cannot do everything that it can do nothing. It can do things, but we have to be very careful of what it can do. And of course, I understand the deception of a lot of countries and a lot of people, but in a certain way, how would be the world without multilateralism, without the UN? And in particular, as I said already, for the weakest countries. That's the point, because of course, for the United States, it doesn't have any difference without or with the UN. But for other countries, it makes a difference.
Can I just add, to begin with, the first point I'd want to make is that I think the exchange between the ambassador for Armenia and the ambassador for Egypt is, for me, just exemplary of how in these spaces there's this extraordinary respect and politeness. It's just lovely. Anyway, I can think, oh, wow. So that would be my first point, and it's kind of reinforcing Sandrine's point, I suppose. But I think what I learned, what historians can tell us in the context of the general kind of tenor of the questions, I think is, and I learned this from Sandrine's work and I learned from doing my own research, is that we can give you a sense of just how broad and big the ambitions associated with multilateralism were in the past. This is not about nostalgia, so it's not saying not transformation. It's saying actually through the 20th century, if we think of the 20th century as defined by this particular international multilateralism, the ambitions associated with it were much greater than states and how they got on and whether diplomats spoke to each other well, as important as that is. They were about the institutionalization, I'd argue, of a kind of international public sphere that mirrored the national, in the sense that we find all sorts of NGOs that were given formal positions, but we also find the refusal of these broader ambitions, the idea that not just states would be represented in this public sphere, actually, but that individuals might, that we might have. I remember looking through lists of written by Americans who were asked to write in about the United Nations in the 1940s as it was being shaped, right? And of course, these are never part of our national histories. If you're American, you don't learn this history. If you're Australian, you don't learn the history of Australians involved, the Indigenous Australians who came to the League of Nations looking for rights they couldn't get in Australia, or the women that went and worked at the League. We don't know, and these should be part of our national histories. But in these archives in the UN, what you find are lists of the kinds of ambitions that people associate with, for example, rights coming out of the UN. Rights for animals. Now, we could go, oh, why would that be there? But actually, in this age of the Anthropocene and of the kinds of climate disasters that we're witnessing, come out of the context of Australia that has just been through apocalyptic bushfires and what we call omnicide, of destruction of animals and nature that we just will not see returned, right? And in that context, yeah, maybe we should have thought about the rights of animals in the 1940s, right? And also, what kind of governance and public sphere could these multilateral institutions represent? Why just states? States co-opted that. We know that Australians, the same Australian that was involved in, pushing for international criminal tribunals also pushed against the extent to which these international organisations could intervene in domestic sovereignty. Now, we've had transformations through ideas like human security that allowed different notions of what the importance of these institutions might be, and we see them in terms of gender norms, for example, and rights questions. But I think, I'm not an expert. I know there are people that do work on this and the idea of transformation. But I think, the important thing we can do as historians is say, yeah, we dreamed bigger in the 20th century. And the international institutions we know now as the embodiment of that multilateralism could have actually looked different and been much more innovative and adventurous than they have been. So they are, I think, we do get in these spaces these wonderful relationships and possibilities that come out of them, but we could have had more.
Well, your turn.
Thank you very much. On that optimist note, I'll... those are your two facets as historians, and it's beautiful to see both. Let me take up maybe Diego. Sorry, I missed your last name point here, and while I think human rights has a certain specific set of challenges and voting behaviors associated to it, I think it'll be interesting to see if voting groups do vote as voting groups, because as I've said before, even the Europeans are not as coordinated as they sometimes like to present themselves as, if it's about Security Council, candidacies, in or outside the West Europe and others group, and so on and so forth. So, and then if we look to the Global South, any kind of coordinated voting that is not strongly influenced by former colonizers, without pointing to any specific countries, will be a step forward, in my personal view. Some people might disagree with this, but sort of an emancipation as a region is something beautiful. And I think here I'll make the link to our Egyptian colleague's question. I think as many problems as there are with the Charter, it's a beautiful document, and there's a beautiful 8th chapter in it that talks about regional arrangements. And these regional arrangements are indeed, as we've said before, the way of achieving progress where it isn't possible at the global level. So to give this space, and this might make Ms. Quinn a bit unhappy, to give the space not for revolution of the global system, but rather for transformation and giving space to other organizations, to countries who are ready to move on, and to give this space and this agency away, will indeed require, of course, organizations in Ethiopia that cater to all of Africa, but it will also require P5 countries who implement their resolutions that they pass. So thinking about today's conversation, we've talked a lot about the Global South, the Southern Hemisphere. We've not talked a lot about those 5 countries that have a lot of power in the current system and their behavior that is at times helpful. And we can think of non-implementation or withdrawal from certain global agreements. And the conversation here would ideally move on in a balanced way to look at who's making progress and who is not making progress. And it is here where we will see that the good intentions in the Global South are more perseverant historically and currently, I would say.
The one thing I'd want to add to that is, and this goes back to the question of transformation and the changing conditions of the present. So it struck me, a while ago when Thomas Piketty's book on capital in the 21st century came out. I think most of you will have read it or looked and knew about it. It's very interesting that, he never mentioned international organisations as having any role in fixing any of the economic inequality, but he also challenged the view that the North and South was the important framing for inequality, economic inequality. So I don't know I'd be interested to hear what you think about this. And his view was that the inequality within states was now much greater than that between, across the North and South, was much greater than that between the North and the South as separate entities. So in a way, the Global South is a problematic concept in the present if we want to transform, so that we would not just be thinking about Egypt and Armenia or anyone else as representing, or African representing the Global South, but we'd be thinking about inequalities within those states and who spoke for which side and how that fitted into a global picture. So I think that is also something we need to take on board if we're thinking about transformation.
But indeed, a lot of the theorizing of Global South was done before the famous emerging new economies, which now pose a different paradigm from within the Global South. Yeah. So if you look at the old concept of Global South, it today contains inequalities that are South-South in genetics. And maybe you want to add something, Ambassador, and also you, Professor Koch, because your area of research on social welfare must sort of show that kind of uneasiness in terms of theoretical foundations.
Absolutely. Of course, there is this idea that, in fact, now the inequality within countries, and it's not just Piketty, but also others have said that is more important than the inequality between countries. I'm not sure it's completely right. So it depends where you look at. And in particular, inequality is also very closely linked to power. And there are countries which are much more powerful than others, that we know. And it creates inequality. I mean, if I come back, you know, to my example about, I mean, not an example because it's the world in which we're living. I mean, the global value chains, for example. Where do they come from? I mean, they don't come from everywhere. They come from special countries. And so there are certain countries which are just at the end of the chains. And these are, there you have the poorest workers of the world. And they are not in the global north. Even if in the global north there are also poor workers, that I would deny that. But the condition in which these people in Bangladesh, for example, because it's an example which is very well known, are working as nothing equivalent to what we have in the global north. So, I mean, I understand, I know Piketty and I know his book and I'm completely sympathetic to it. But, you know, I mean, you should really look at this global value chain right now. It's very important. And in particular, the way you have this international standard system, which are bypassing international organization and, you know, doing kind of private norms for this thing, which I find outrageous. Absolutely, and that's why, you know, we have to save multilateralism, because at least there you have people who know what they're doing and they're not private and they're not paid by big enterprises, you know, to make norms. That's something which is important. It's what we have to deal with right now. So that's what I would answer to your question.
Yes. The issue that you, Professor, had just brought up for the discussion is very interesting, and I think we could take days, not only the remaining time of our talk. It's true that there is inequalities within countries, but we have to address the question and the reason for that. One of the reasons that, unfortunately, ODAs were not respected. There are some very clear commitments on the part of global north, which unfortunately only very few countries had respected their commitments in this regard. So African country, and going back to our colleague on the African Union, they decided to take up their own destiny and to find solutions for these inequalities that are facing. This is why in 2019 and under the presidency of Egypt for the African Union, we finally managed to announce the entry into force of the Continental Free Trade Area in Africa. And this is a major shift in the history of Africa, where African countries decided to join hands and to find new ways for regional integration, economic integration, and to find their own creative solutions for financing. And one of the colleagues was talking about, I think it was you, who was talking about how come that the African countries were able now to find creative ways for financing their operations, peacekeeping operations in Africa. And this helped a lot in finding peace and security in many conflicts of Africa. And we believe that economic and social integration is a must to be able to reach a common ground and to find solutions for many problems facing Africa through creative ideas for self-financing.
We have some time for a couple of questions, if there is still appetite for questions for our panelists. The time is now. I see one hand there. That's all? Okay.
Hi, I'm Anne. I'm an anthropologist actually of supply chains, and my question really builds off of your comment, Professor Cott, about, I was wondering how you would all look at multilateralism with respect to the international corporation, which usually supersedes, in many ways, undermines nation states. And the tools that have emerged to combat this are things like strategic litigation, which in many ways reinforces national boundaries. When you have a country suing another country for let's say reparations for labor infringements, etc. You also have the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, which is much more in the classical UN method of addressing these issues. And I was wondering, actually, it was a question for the whole panel on how you would address corporate interests and international corporations and value chains along those lines. Thank you.
Well, I suggest we go. There is another question? Oh yeah, sorry, I hadn't seen you.
Thank you very much. My name is Miankura Maruson. I am not affiliated yet. I'm considering research, but not. I haven't made up my mind yet. So my question is also a kind of linked. Okay, my question is a little bit linked to that, the issue of multi-corporations, multinational corporations, but also other actors as well, whether civil society, groups of civil movements, armed groups, and do we anticipate in the near future less power from the state, or we might think in a really longer term, but more fragmented powers that are really divided? That's my question. And then my second question, and I really appreciate Ambassador Ala Yusuf being here today. And and I would like to go back to the issue of implementation that you referred to, because truly the treaties, the resolutions are really key in shaping this multilateralism, the relationship between states, at least regulating them, but also shaping them in a way, in a common direction or aspiration. And so going back to the issue of human rights now, and then you said that when Egypt was taking care of the presidency of the African Union, you really worked very hard towards economic integration, regional integration. But it was also the time when, despite the African states committing to human rights, either through treaties, the creation of institutions like the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, yes. It was also the time when the African Union Commission had to step in a little bit to limit in some ways the ways or how far the African Commission was willing to go with regards to certain rights. So my question is, and I'm really asking, it's a very candid question, what do you think it would take for human rights actually to be implemented, knowing that some rights do not need that much money to actually be, adhered to or respected? Thank you.
Thank you. So I suggest we have a round of answers to these both questions. Maybe you, Ambassador, you want to go first, and then each of you, and that would draw us to a wrap.
I will start with the two comments made on the human rights and multinationals and the business. It's true that this is another forum where, unfortunately, agreement was not reached for many years. And you have to understand the reason why. There are many interests. Each side have its own interest, even his own multinational companies working here or there. So it's not easy, but this does not mean that it's impossible. On the contrary, we're conducting many rounds of consultations. We're trying to bridge the gap, and we're trying to find solutions. And this is about the United Nations and about multilateral system in general, that we need to take the time to not to impose anything on the other side, but try to find a solution acceptable for all sides. And this is maybe one of the reasons why it took some time in the two working groups on the business and international corporations. And here I would like to go back to the point I made earlier on. We have another field, right, development. We had this declaration for more than almost 20 years. And unfortunately, we are not able throughout these 20 years to find or to agree on a legally binding instrument to implement this declaration on right to development. But this does not mean that we have to accept this situation. On the contrary, we will continue to talk and try to explain better the positions of each side in order to reach a common ground. On the second point related to human rights, I don't think that the African Union has been trying to reduce human rights in some parts. But what actually we are calling for is to treat human rights equally. We cannot just restrict or to limit human rights on right of expression, for example. While it's very important, and this is definitely the main, one of the main human rights, But we have as well to look for right to develop, right for housing, right for a job, right to have better health conditions. These are important rights that we need to treat it equally to the other rights. But I think that there is a strong determination in the African continent to pursue this openness to all human rights and to continue this path. You mentioned this, the Committee on Human Rights which exists in Gambia, which has very important meetings. I think they meet twice a year, and they make recommendations to member states, and members are accountable to this committee. And the last session was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2019. So I think there is a move, but we have to bear in mind something very important. We have to respect the gradual approach of dealing with human rights. We cannot just ask one country to open up 180 degrees, but we have to respect that this has to be opened in a gradual manner to make sure that the country will not be subject to instability or any problems that might arise. We have to respect as well the culture of the country and the social system in this country. We have to give the country its own right to determine which line of, which path for human rights they have to choose.
Who wants to go second? Yeah.
Very quickly. It has been a very long discussion, as you know. I mean, it was already in the Bandung Declaration. And of course, you know, in the 70s, you have the Chile delegate, which was pointing to the fact that some important transnational corporations were really a threat for the sovereignty of some countries, as we know, because there have been, you know, some coup against some governments just directly linked to some multinational corporations. So it was a threat to really political sovereignty of some countries. So it was not just something which was connected to economic inequality, but also political sovereignty of some countries. So it has been, from the beginning of the non-aligned movement, it has been one of the main issues of the non-aligned countries. And the only place in which they could really raise the question internationally was the UN. And there has been a committee on transnational cooperation set up after the declaration of the new international economic order in 1974. The ILO has also a declaration on multinational cooperation. But then, you know, I mean, the point is that the world has changed. The world has changed in the 80s, as we know, 1980s, and it's not for nothing. And the world has changed toward a more neoliberal orientation, as we all know, and less regulation. And for example, like the Committee on Transnational Cooperation has been just shut down in 1992. I mean, and the point is that without a balance of power in favor of a regulation, you won't have any regulation. That's it. It's not that there is no idea about regulation. There are a lot of ideas, but right now, nothing.
But I think, you know, that question also goes back to the point you made about private and international, private and public forms of international multilateralism, if you like. So what we still don't understand, and if we're looking at the 100 years of multilateralism in Geneva, I think what historians haven't done, and we're starting to do, and I know I'm interested in this, is to understand the extent to which private interests, which aren't, you know, individuals looking for rights, but actually companies looking for representation in these international institutions, had influence within that system that we think of as a kind of public system, but also to the extent to which through the 20th century, particularly in the latter part, as Sandrine's been saying, they have used they have claimed the right or the authority to represent issues that are relevant to them without arbitration by an external third party. So they have become the arbiters of their own international international regulation, if you like. And that is, you know, I think it's something that you can read really good studies of it in the present. There's a new book by Katharina Pistor on international economic law and how that's all happened. But I think, you know, we need to go back and start to pull apart a bit more as historians these different interests represented in the idea of international multilateralism, how they become part of the institutions. You know, and the one example I'd want to point to where the idea of the global north and south was really important was the 1972 UN Stockholm Conference on the Environment, where in fact what stalled progress on the first time that global governance and environment and awareness of climate change was being debated and discussed was in fact the problem of the global north and south and economic inequality in relationship to who had responsibility for dealing with these climate issues. So, and in that same context, the closer you look, the more you see that already then the UN was actually bringing on board multinational corporations and businesses as important voices, as part of the public sphere. Not because there's a conspiracy, but actually it was a kind of notion of the public sphere and whose interests get represented, which is interesting and strange. And then what happens afterwards and how now we have these different locations of international multilateralism. So if we're thinking about transformation, you know, the problem is how complex it's become and has been, and making sure that we understand actually not only the past, but the present in those terms.
Thank you. I'll just briefly add a little bit to corporations and the state. And I think we're at a really, really interesting time where we see two opposite effects. One effect is where states need to push corporations to do the right thing. And that's the example of Bangladesh, where we see that the self-regulation doesn't work. So this is, it could also be human rights and resource extraction, where we'll have a vote in Switzerland later on this, where the people have come and said companies need to act differently. That's one side. There's another side as well in which we find ourselves now, in which corporations might be in a position to push states. And I'm thinking again of the example of climate, where some companies in the global north have started pushing their governments to say, do more, please. And so there's two effects, and I think what we all agreed upon here is important is this sort of inevitability of dealing with corporations as actors to get forward. And I think that applies both to use these terms once more before we enter the global north and to the global south as well, where corporations, both local and international, have played important, sometimes critical, but in any case, important roles.
And that could be indeed a way to transcend these notions of global south and global north going forward. We hope so, at least. So thank you so much, Professor Kot, Professor Sluga, Ambassador Youssef, and Welly. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for all of you coming out for this. I hope you enjoyed it. You're going to see on screen one of the next ones next month. So hope to see you again. Thank you for your time.